Yes, ma'am.
Okay, let's start today's class. Did you started reading your textbooks? Let's go to the block 3. Let me share PPT. Yes. Block 3, today's topic, block 3, the Indian novel, analyzing themes and ideas. The Indian novel from 1950s to 1980s. A journey through the Indian literature. Give me a second. So, historical context. What is the impact of the Indian independence in 1947 on the literature and the socio-political landscape from 1950s to the 1980s? And the influence of the historical events like the emergency, like 1975 to 1977. So, here are the prominent themes from the Unit 10, social and the political issues, caste and the class struggles, urbanization and the modernization, partition and its aftermath, feminism and the women issues. These are the main themes from this unit. Indian women's question. So it was because again 10th unit. Let's come back to once. Unit 10. Here we have the three main authors, writers, R.K. Narayan, Mulkraj Anand, and the Raja Rao. And these are the prominent themes of these writers. Let's go to the women, Indian women fictions. So, here is a brief introduction of the Indian women fiction, the importance of the women voices in literature, and the overview of the presentation of the structure. The main themes and the concerns in the women fiction is the Desa and the Deshpande's fiction can be listed are listed. Space of the home as a political space where the power relations are at work, how social and cultural contexts such as the patriarchy, professions, and class affect women in their family and domestic context, the crisis of sexuality, the body and the identity of women, the psychological impact of marriage, social relations, and family upon women. The myth of marriage as a safe space for women by showing how women are oppressed, driven mad, or abused within the family. Identity, sexual, ethnic, national, socio-political, cultural of women. Historical context. Marriage, family, and the power. These also women's fiction often threats marriage as a space where the identity of the woman herself is submerged. The woman's role is predetermined to her as wife or daughter-in-law or a mother or a sister. That power relations within a family or a marriage are inevitably in favor of the males. Early women writers like Kamala Markandeya shows traditional views about marriage coming into conflict with criticism of marriage from women. Thus, Rukmani, mother in Markandeya's Nectar in a Sea, asks her, The early contributions of the Indian women writers, post-independence literacy scene, the socio-political backdrop of the 1950s and the 1980s. The key authors, their contributions between the 1950s to 1980s is the Kamala Markandeya, Anita Desai, and Nayanthara Sehgal. So the key work of the Kamala Markandeya is a Nectar in a Sea. The themes of these writings are the rural life, poverty, and the resilience. Anita Desai's key works are The Cry, The Peacock, Clear Light of the Day. And the themes are psychological depth, family dynamics. And the Nayanthara Sehgal's key works are The Rich Like Us, A Time to Be Happy. The themes are political change, women's anatomy. These are the main themes and the keywords of the three important writers, women writers from 1950s to 1980s. Patriarchy, the social order, and the women. Social relations of women, modernity and tradition are symbolized in women. Themes in Indian women's fiction. These are some important themes in the Indian women's fiction writings are identity and self-discovery, exploration of personal and cultural identity, gender roles and patriarchy, critique of traditional gender roles and patriarchy, social justice and political context, depiction of social inequalities and political unrest, marriage and domestic life, examination of marriage, family dynamics, and women independence. Post-colonial feminism means post-independence feminism. Western models of feminism do not work for Asian women. Western feminism emphasizes the individual over and above everything else. In the Asian or African context, the individual is usually connected to and embedded in the family, community, and group. Caste, class, and social identities matter a great deal to the Asian women. Post-independence feminism is concerned with the cultural differences among women, the differences in lived experience for Asian women as compared with Western women, the refusal to see marriage as a goal of a woman's life, women's bonding and sisterhood as a domain that is inaccessible to men, the expression of feminine sexuality and desire, the search for alternate modes of life, such as spiritual dimensions, as opposed to the modernized and secular Western mode. Women's fiction in English focuses on three main issues: marriage, power, and the gender roles for women, patriarchy and the social order, post-colonial feminism. Writers like Desai, Deshpande, and Manju Kapoor see marriage as an institution that replicates social power relations and inequalities. The home and family in most of these novels are not the safe space where women can be secure. Instead, these become spaces of oppression and injustice. Women are invested with the responsibility of maintaining the tradition. Post-colonial feminist writers like Geeta Hariharan and Arundhati Roy represent women as bonding among themselves, as expressing their sexuality and feminine desire, thereby breaking the patriarchal taboos imposed upon them. Arundhati Roy maps a different kind of post-colonial feminism in The God of Small Things. Three generations of a family have women who react differently to gender-based oppression. Mamachi and baby Kochama remains firmly within the patriarchal setup and do not dare defy gender norms. In the second generation, we have Ammu who breaks the sexual taboos and has an affair, thereby suggesting a certain amount of feminine sexual independence. Finally, Rahul marries an American, divorces him, and dares to return to her small village as a single woman who rejects the role the village carves for her. So the feminine sexuality becomes a focus for a number of post-colonial feminists. Namita Gokhle's Sparrow, the Manju Kapoors are married women, show women characters who are not ashamed of their bodies or sexuality or the desires. They refuse to remain limited by their femininity and seek a freedom of the body, language, and expression beyond what the patriarchal society grants them. In this exploration of feminine sexuality, we see one of the highest points of feminist thought in Indian fiction. Women are also caught up in the politics, local and national of the moment, as this novel shows. Postmodern Indian novel. Global influences and the local narratives, historical context of the Indian literature from 1950s to 1980s, brief overview of the Indian literature post-independence, socio-political factors influencing literature, emergence of modernist and the post-modernist trends globally and in India. So this unit introduced to the Indian novel since the mid-1980s, characterized by its post-modern modes of narration. The work of Rushdie, Ghosh, Seeley, Kesavan, and others has acquired global visibility and acclaim for being innovative, experimental, and challenging. For postmodernism, everything like truth, aesthetics, politics are the result of the representation. Whether in literature, film, images, or print, that is, postmodernism calls for a greater attention to the language, in which philosophers, literary critics, filmmakers, politicians represent the world. Truth, beauty, political beliefs are all available to us only through language. Postmodernism sees history as history. History is a kind of storytelling. Postmodernism argues that story writing, like storytelling, cannot claim objective truths. It very often mixes up with dream states with reality, reality with magic, history with individual autobiography. Therefore, it does not believe in a pure form, it argues instead of impure. Contaminated forms of the novel, form of drama. It also prefers fragmentation and chaotic narrative like storytelling rather than the linear and chronological one. History and the postmodern Indian novels. Fragmentation of the narrative, non-linear storytelling, multiple perspectives. Intertextuality, references to other literary works, cultures, or media. Metafication, self-referential narratives questioning the nature of fiction. One of the first novels to experiment with the ways of telling history was Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. Throughout the novel, Rushdie linked the life of the Sinai family with Indian history. This means a public history is linked to a private individual one. The birth of Salim Sinai is connected to the birth of the new India at the stroke of midnight, 15th August 1947. Rashid's description has two powerful images. That is mysteriously handicapped to history, my destinies indiscussibly chained to those of my country for the next 3 decades, there was no escape. He is described also as fathered by history. The two images suggest two things, an arrest, captivity, and a condition of no escape, but also a family lineage, a relationship, and an ancestry. Several such incidents are sprinkled throughout the book. In fact, it becomes difficult to see where private or the individual family history ends and national history begins in these novels. All Indian lives are connected in certain ways to larger historical forces. History makes little sense except when individuals experience it at local, individual, and personal levels. History is in these individuals. To tell the story of a nation is to see how the nation operates at the micro level, that of individuals. History is therefore autobiography. To assume there is different way of telling history is to assume that such a telling is more truthful. That is, we cannot think of history writing as being more truthful than an individual's perception, because all history is told through somebody's perception. History is therefore subjective, it's not objective. History must be read at local and specific levels. What matters is local histories, whether it is a road that changes relations in a community or the emergency, rather than larger national histories. This makes the postmodern Indian novel a version of Indian history. It deliberately shows how individual, familial, and the national stories intersect and come into conflict. History in all these novels is therefore unreliable. Playfulness in the postmodern Indian novel. Postmodern playful in the Indian after Rashid come in the form of narrative shows in a unrelatably of memory and the absence of authoritative history or even story. The playfulness also occurs as an alternate realities constructed by individuals, often through accidents. As we have noted, Block 1, Unit 3, Section 1, nations are imagined because we as a people imagine connections, feel emotionally attached to other distant people. In a powerful swing, Rashid Salim's Nine cuts a political article from the newspaper and rearranges them randomly. This rearranged set of events is for Salim a new reality. And what follows is a new reality. Salim sends a message to Captain Sabarmati about his wife using such cut up newspaper letters. So, how is history to be narrated? Do we all have total recall when we tell a story? As we have noted earlier in this unit, postmodernism thrives on fragmentation and non-linear narration. We can also know bits and pieces of the world and possess bits and pieces of the knowledge. The task is to convey the available knowledge in the form of fragments. In Midnight's Children, history comes to us not through historical records or archives. Instead, what we have are fragments from which we need to cull or develop a history. Thus, we have newspaper clippings, songs from films, photographs, and personal anecdotes. What we have here is a playful postmodern fragmentation of memory itself. Fragmentation is an important narrative device in postmodern Indian fiction. There is no authoritative or attentive memory in Rashid's Keshavan, Sile, or Ghosh. Instead, we have non-linear, chaotic, dispersed narratives. Rashid uses the powerful image of broken mirror in his essay, Imaginary Homelands, to speak of this fragmented sense of reality, a home constructed out of broken mirrors, some of whose fragments have been irretrievably lost. In Midnight's Children, various parts of the Salim Sinai's bodies are chopped off. Fragments views are also limited to partial sightings, as in the story of the perforated sheet with which the novel begins. Salim Snag gives us the best definition of the unreliable fragmented memory. It selects, eliminates, alters, exaggerates, minimizes, glorifies, and vilifies also. Major themes in the postmodern Indian novels: identity and the hybridity, exploration of complex identities in a globalized world, history and memory, interrogation of historical narratives and personal memory, urbanization and globalization impact on culture, society, and individual lives. Magic realism, generic blurring, and the postmodern Indian novel. This is a magic realism of postmodern Indian fiction where the genre of novel mixes with the dream narrative, with the fantasy, magic realism, fuses reality with the dream sequence, ghosts, humans, demons, and are all on the same plane in the narrative. Time sequences, past, present, and future are mixed up. Flashbacks merge with the present but are often shown as anticipating the future. Real events in the history become the subject of individuals' dreams so that historical memory cannot be relied on. Blurs, genres, and generic boundaries, fantasy, newspaper reportage, popular music, cinema, history, writings, folklore. In Mukul Kesavan's Looking Through Glass and Sile's Protanama, we have songs and radio music working with the narrative. Rashid constantly uses Hindi film songs as a part of the story. Dreams and reality merge, and it is difficult to distinguish between the two. The use of narrative methods of storytelling are and inspired by texts like Arabian Nights or folklore. Rashid Keswan and other post-colonial writers, Ben Okri, Gabriel Marquis, results in fiction where the English Western narrative styles, the novel is merged with the alternate modes of storytelling. As we noted about Kantapura in an earlier unit, this undermines the authority of the Western genre. The Western novel is indigenized by the author so that it no more represents authoritative storytelling. It is crucial to note here that merged in the postmodern Indian novel in English. Take the case of Alan Sillay's Trotternaama. Trotter refers to the family whose chronicle the tale is supposed to be. The Nama is a traditional form of Islamic Persian history writing. We can think of the Baburnama, Jahangirnama, and the chronicle of the European family in the Sillay's novel is delivered through a form that is Persian. Magic realism and the unreliable narrator in such fiction ensure that all meanings are temporary, personal, fragmented, and partial. In a crucial passage, Rashid writes, history is always ambiguous, facts are hard to establish and capable of many meanings. These many meanings are dependent on the individual. The idea of the nation does not enthuse the people because for many it is fantastic. In Keshwan's Looking Through Glass, Masroor and his friends join the Muslim League because it might help him consolidate his grip on reality. Here, Kesavan reduces nationalism and national identity to a fantasy that governs people's actions. In each of these cases, we see how postmodern play makes the story nonlinear, uses multiple forms and genres of storytelling, mixes serious history with dreams, and invented fantasies. This unit has explored the Indian novel of the 1890s and 1990s. We examined three key features of Rashid's, Keshavan's, and Sile's. The role of history and history writings in these novelists. Postmodern playfulness, magic realism, and blurring of genres. Postmodern in the Indian cultural context, influences of Indian mythology, folklore, and oral traditions. Critique of colonial legacies and post-colonial identity. Representation of marginalized voices, gender, caste, and religion. The novel of the Indian diaspora. Introduction to the Indian diaspora. Definition of the Indian diaspora. Global presence and the significant communities. US, UK, Canada, etc. Importance of literature in understanding the diasporic experiences. This unit introduces you to the fiction written by Indians who are diasporic, that is, who have migrated to other nations. Diaspora writings accepts to deal with the displacement of individuals from one country, home, and culture to other. Diaspora means scattering or distribution of people who are previously concentrated in one place. Migration, exile, displacement, and travel have always been a part of human history. When people who belong originally to one religion travel out and encounter new cultures, then many of them lost some of their original cultures, habits, and practices. Adopt the practices of the new cultures that they have encountered. In some cases, the people who have been displaced by necessity, such as refugees and exiles, are anguished by the loss of their homeland and culture and are nostalgic about their loss. Many of these features are to be found in the writings of Bharati Mukherjee, Chitra Divapurni, Meena Alexander. Diaspora writings is marked with following themes. Identity and belonging culture, hybridity and dual identity, nostalgia, and longing for homeland, immigration, and the diasporic struggles. The relation between the center or the home and the periphery into which they and their families dispersed, a diaspora consciousness of nostalgia, both individual and group, for the home they have left behind. A sense of alienation in a new society, culture, land. A desire to retain features from the homeland. This includes a determined effort to retain rituals, language, forms of behavior, and anxiety over adaptation to new cultures. Consciousness attempt to assert ethnic identity in terms of the homeland while simultaneously seeking acceptance, assimilation in the new cultures. Diaspora consciousness. Challenges and the critics. Authenticity and the representation issues, stereotypes and oversimplification, criticism from within diasporic communities. Diaspora consciousness. Diaspora consciousness is the sensibility of the immigrant. Diaspora literature often maps this consciousness in three ways: the theme of nostalgia, the theme of displacement, travel, and rootlessness, theme of accumulation. adaptation to the new cultures. Robin Cohen, a distinguished scholar of diaspora, writes, them are communities living together in one country who acknowledge that the old country, a notion often buried deep in language, religion, custom, or folklore, always has some claim on their loyalty and emotions. A member's adherence to a diasporic community is demonstrated by an acceptance of an inescapable link with their past migration history and the sense of co-ethnicity with others of a similar background. In diasporic cultures, an individual has a linkage to the former home and the present one, to a culture left behind and to a culture now adopted. Thus, diaspora suggests two sides: geographical locations and cultural affiliation. This results in a split identity. Diaspora consciousness has therefore two components: the nostalgic recall for the former home and the pain of adaptation to new cultures or being between cultures. The first component, nostalgic recall, often results in the desire for a return home, even though the home has been lost for many years. The nostalgic component of a diaspora consciousness results very often in imagining a home, in assuming that the home that the migrant left behind is the same even now. The critic of the draft writes that home is a mythic place of desire in diasporic imagination. In Bharati Mukherjee's The Tiger's Daughter, she writes, for years, Tara had dreamt of returning to India. She had believed that all hesitations, all shadowy fears of the time abroad would be erased quite magically if she could just return to Calcutta. Hybridity and the mimicry. In V.S. Naipaul's The Middle Passage, he writes, in the immigrant colonial society with no standards of its own, minds are rigidly closed, and residents of all races and classes are remaking themselves in the image of the Hollywood beamer. Naipaul, whose forefathers were from India, is speaking from the immigrant who adopts the culture of the new space. He sees them as mimics, who simply imitates a new culture without understanding it, and often lose their sense of self and identity in such mimicry. Hybridity is a condition of multiple identities and cultures an immigrant adopts after displacement into new culture. An excellent example of this confused, uncertain nature of hybrid identity is seen in Naipaul's A House for Mr. Biswas. The novel Ganesh seeks to improve his social standing by acquiring literacy in English and aspiring to become as English as possible. Ganesh's house mixes Indian and Western cultures. It at once cosmopolitan and native. He is caught between the vernacular and the English language. He tries to retain his strong beliefs in Hinduism, but yet wants to be known as the cosmopolitan. Equilibration, multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism. In Jasmine, Bharati Mukherjee novel about migration, the protagonist, Jyoti, arrives in the USA as an illegal immigrant. However, Jyoti does not carry a sense of nostalgia for a lost home. Instead, she is an immigrant who seeks to adopt new cultures. Jasmine hopes to rebirth in the image dreams writes Mukherjee as an index of her attempts as at equilibration. She changes her name frequently to Zazie and then subsequently Jace and Jane in sharp contrast. The Vadera family And the novel tries hard to retain a sense of their original Indianness. From the 1990s, we see Indian writers who celebrate dislocation, travel, and displacement. This literature of diaspora is characterized by a concern with displacement, it's sought after multiculturalism, a cosmopolitan sensibility, a celebration of hybrid identities. Cosmopolitanism sensibility is the acceptance and celebration of global cultures. It means that one feels comfortable and at home anywhere in the world. One is able to appropriate various cultures, whether in food or fashion. Cosmopolitanism is, of course, a result of globalization and the massive traffic of ideas, fashion, food, finance, and people. Pico Iyer, Vikram Seth, Salman Rushdie are examples of writers who are equally at home discussing Western music in the streets of Tokyo or Delhi and whose cultural interests are varied. Seth writes in his travelogue from Heavenly travels through Xinjiang and Tibet. Diaspora writings attempts to deal with the displacement of individuals from one country, home, and culture to another country. This literature is about people who, having left behind one country and culture, seek to make a home in a new place. Diaspora writings is characterized by a sense of nostalgia for the former home and an anxiety about the new one. The diasporic sensibility is always caught between the longing for the former home and the need to adopt to the new one. In some cases, the nostalgia is overcome when the immigrant mimics the adopted culture. This results in a hybrid identity where the immigrant has not been able to fully abandon his or her old culture and has unthinkingly taken on the new one. Since the 1990s, however, writers have dealt with the immigrant cultures that seem to have adapted to the new cultures. Cosmopolitan sensibilities enable such as new generations, immigrants to appropriate without nostalgia or anxiety a new culture. They feel at home in any part of the world. More significantly, the cultural geography of the first world city is also radically altered. New York and London lost their distinctive white culture as Bangladeshis, Africans, Indians, and South Americans speaking all languages alongside English. These cities also become multicultural and cosmopolitan. Rohinton's mysteries, a fine balance, themes, characters, and social commentary, exploration of personal and cultural identity. The brief biography of the author, overview of his literary style and themes, social justice and political context, depiction of social inequalities and political unrest, friendship and human connections, the impact of political turmoil on ordinary lives. A fine balance is the story of a Percy widow, Dinadalal Manik, and two untouchable tailors, Ishwar or and Om Prakash, whose lives become victim to Indian politics. Ishwar and Om come to Mumbai to escape the caste prejudices in their village. Manik, from the small mountain village in the northern India, moves to the city to acquire a degree certificate. Reena is trying to earn a living after the death of her husband, and she rents out a room to Manik and hires the tailors to help her with her stitching business. how the emergency affects all their lives is Mystery's focus. And he shows how politics is not something that happens outside or beyond our lives. It is something that has very powerful consequences for our everyday lives as well. Thus, during the emergency, Ishwar and Om lost their home and are forcibly shifted to a labor camp. Tina loses her home and is forced to live after her brother's charity. During the forced sterilization camp, Om is castrated and Ishwar's legs have to be amputated due to infection. 8 years later, Manik returns to the Gulf where he had gone for a job to the anti-sick program. He also discovers all his old friends, Tina, the tailors, become destitute and helpless. The sheer enormity of the tragedy depresses him and he commits suicide at his inability to do anything. The novel captures the many failures of independent India and shows how 3 decades after independence, the old social and economic problems persist, but for different reasons. The state politics and individuals. Find balance above everything else is a criticism of the corruption and degeneration of the Indian state and its government. Set in the dark period of the emergency, the novel shows how individuals' lives are altered for the worse of the state that is meant to protect them. The following aspects of the Indian state and the politics come in for attention in the novel. The inability to eradicate the evils of the caste system in rural India. The continued exploitation of the poor by rich. The absence of safety and the welfare measures for widows and helpless women. Class and social inequalities even 30 years after independence. The effective support of business houses by the government at the cost of the general public. The rejection of the right to protest. The manipulation of the state's machinery by the ruling political party. Oppression, injustice, and exploitation in Mystery's novel is done by the state, the caste system, the upper classes. Effectively, nothing has changed for the poor because they continue to suffer at the hands of the government, upper caste, and the wealthy classes. College student Avinash is taken away by the police and eventually killed by them and disguised as a train accident for protesting against the emergency. The government becomes dictatorial and refuses the right to streik or protest. The Prime Minister's declaration yesterday of the internal emergency had inculcated most of the parliamentary opposition along with thousands of trade unions, students and social workers. No more strikes and marches and silly disturbances. The government and the business houses work together to ruin the people, small businesses, and the environment. This is Mystery's description of what happens in the hillsides. Engineers in solar topics arrived with their sinister instruments and charted their designs on reams of paper. They promised roads that would hum with the swift passage of modern traffic. Roads wide and heavy duty to replace scenic mountain paths too narrow for the broad vision of nation builders and World Bank officials. There is some resistance to the oppressive society, classes, and the state. The lower caste villages rebel against custom by not following the dictates of the upper caste landlords. Ishwar and Om too refuse to become Leather workers, a profession supposedly ordained by the caste. Manik's father hold out against the big businesses and refuses to adopt their mercenary and the unethical policies. Avinash and the students organize protest against the imposition of emergency. Dina works hard to maintain her independence from Usman, her obnoxious brother. However, history sees the power of the government as overwhelming and the greed in society's upper class and too deep to fight against. The resistance is easily overcome. Ishwar and Om's families are like. Manik's father loses his business. The student leaders resisting the emergency were arrested, and some, like Avinash, are even killed quietly. Dina loses her flat. Manik, faced with the enormity of despite kills himself. Dispossession, non-belonging, and the post-colonial condition. The post-colonial condition, according to Mystery, is an unjust and oppressive one. Freedom for the country does not mean freedom for all its people. The novel suggests this argument is suggested through the theme of dispossession. One of the novel's key themes is dispossession, literally to deprive somebody of their possessions. In the previous section, we have seen how the state works to reduce human beings to their bare lives without rights or dignity. In the novel, dispossession refers to the people losing not only their worldly possessions but also their very human qualities. The theme of dispossession has the following aspects. The state is responsible for the dispossession of millions. The law functions as an instrument of the state in this aspect. The city becomes the site of new forms of dispossession. The loss of livelihood and property is the material component of dispossession. The individuals in the novel finally are disposed of their identity and dignity and reduced to animal-like figures, the tailors. Through these methods of dispossession, new untouchables, the poor, are created in free India. Class and caste oppression, the dispossession merge in modern India suggests mystery. The state is blind in its attitudes, and the legal system follows a very narrow path with no attention to the human element. This is illustrated by a particular incident in the novel where the slums of the poor are to be demolished. The definition of what constitutes a home or house is what the law looks at. It ignores the fact that for the poor, the hurt is the real address. The denial of a ration card based on its ridiculous definition of what constitutes a real address is an index of the complete indifferences and inhumanity of the state. It is important to see the way in which caste-based disposition merges with class-based one. In their village, Ishwar and Om are dispossessed, not allowed their choice of profession or to own hand. Because of their caste, Dukhi is deprived of his livelihood because his children do not practice a profession forced upon them by their caste. The forced sterilization program ruins Ishwar and Om's bodies, deprives them of any human dignity, and they are reduced to beggars. Once they come to the city, their caste become less dignity and they are reduced to beggars. The caste become less important. However, this does not mean that their conditions improve. What mystery does is to show how in the new India, there is new category of untouchables, the poor. In the city, they exploited, brutalized, humiliated, and eventually made into beggars by the police. the law, the economic system, and the government. The state's so-called program for progress is actually harmful to most people. The city belongs to you, keep it beautiful. Food for the hungry, home for the homeless. The nation is on the move. This is a slogan the poor and the displaced are treated to in Mystery's novel. Ironically, the beautification of the city is to be achieved when the poor are taken away from the city. They do not belong to the beautiful space of the city. None of these promises are fulfilled. The city can be made beautiful only when the poor are disposed. The city develops new forms of dispossession. The law works against the poor and ensures that tailors lose their home. Dina Dalal, unable to protect herself from the corrupt law, eventually has to lose her flat and move in with her brother. What is so powerful about Mystery's criticism is that in the city, where the law is supposed to be more effective than in the rural areas, we see the law itself is an instrument of dispossession. Dispossession means that in independent India, some people, classes, and groups do not belong. That is, they have no power in governance, economics, or politics. Dispossession results in a condition of non-belonging. Mystery's novel raises the following questions. Who belongs to the space of the nation? Conversely, to whom does the sovereign space of the nation belong? How is belonging demonstrated? Social realism and the humanism. The narrative style of the fine balance is that a social realism, a style we see in the Bhavanis Bhattacharya's Kamala Markandeya and the novelists of the 1950s and the 1960s. Social realism is a mode by which social problems are described in great detail. The aim is to show the inner workings of any society to be as close to the real lives of people as possible, depict the suffering and anguish of real fantasies and other such escapist literary modes. Social realism linked to the philosophical and political principles of humanism. Humanism is a philosophy that believes that any human, is one of the greatest importance. In fact, it treats the law, technology, history, and the government as structures that most contributes to the general good of everyone, every human. It looks at the needs and interests of humans and rates it as a higher cause than law and order of governance. Humans have value intrinsically, and this value is not based on their class, caste, or gender identities. In a fine balance, the social realist mode used by mysteries shows how the human is marginalized in society. Suffering is based on their identities, and so is their pleasure and security. In social realist novels, the human is placed at the center so that our attention is drawn to the ways in which the human is degraded, the social order, where the human is defined or rejected. In the novel, we see that the law becomes more important as seen in the ration card incident quoted in the previous section. Wealth determines the value of human life. This means individuals who have no wealth and whose identities are rejected as useless by society. For example, an innocent sees migrants on the Bombay streets as a nuisance rather than the homeless humans and are treated as less than human. Mystery's novel is study of the failure of the Indian nation state. It shows how the state and the government works against the interest of the poor. Mystery shows how the government fails to eradicate the evils of the caste system in rural India, enables the exploitation of the poor by the rich, has failed to remove class and social inequalities. Even 30 years after independence, he also shows how the state is responsible for the dispossession of millions as many lost their livelihood and property, and therefore new untouchables, the poor, are created in free India. Using the social realist mode, Mysteries shows how in free India the human is degraded and the failure of the corrupt social order through a manipulation of the state's machinery by the ruling political powers. Block 3 completed, and the last one is a block 4, Indian poetry and the drama. This will complete in the next class. A second. We'll complete the last block in the next class. Block 4, Indian poetry and the drama. We'll discuss a new any important questions. Okay. Next class, I'll make you note on the important questions, and I'll play the same in the PPT slides so that you can also take the screenshots instead of noting. I'll display the important questions, important topics as well. Okay. Thank you. Have a nice day.